the most important thing to remember about the Arctic region is that it is the Earth's air conditioning system. Oh my God. Hello? Hi, friends. Oh, this is so much nicer. Okay. The albedo effect is what happens when more of the sun's heat is reflected back out of the atmosphere than is taken in by the atmosphere. That happens because the Arctic is white, and it's thick ice, white ice. If you doubt that the albedo effect, wear a pair of black trousers outside in the middle of summer and then put a white pair on and you will see the difference immediately. So that is what the Arctic does for us, and it's the same thing with ocean currents. That red area you see there, let's see if this little pointer does anything. It's obviously right around the equatorial regions. And the ocean currents are always in motion as well. And they do the same thing. They are carried down to the Antarctic and up to the Arctic. And when that happens, they are cooled and they come back cooler. The Arctic is the Earth's air conditioning system. The problem is there is, because of technology, more recently, a huge economic impetus to change the nature of the Arctic region. Transportation. In the 1500s and 1600s, the whole idea was to find a shorter route from Europe to the Orient or the Indies, East Asia as it happens, Southeast Asia, etc. What's happened now is we have the technology. The Russians have nuclear-powered icebreakers that can cut through 3 meters over 9 feet of solid pack ice. They can tear it to shreds. And that route is a lot shorter for the shippers and the exporters. Resources. There are estimates that 36% or more of the world's remaining fossil fuels are locked in the Arctic. So there is another economic impetus to destroy pieces of the Arctic. Agriculture. The idea, especially for a nation like Russia that has huge amounts of land in the Arctic region that have been under permafrost, well, what if we could turn that into more valuable farmland? The reason I have the question mark up there is that stuff has been under permafrost since the last ice age. One other comment, environmentally or geologically. Typically, Earth is a lot colder than it is today. We typically go roughly 100,000 years of glaciation, roughly 10 or 12,000 years in an interglacial period. We're at the 11,500 year mark now. So we've been under permafrost even during this warming period. What happens if you do lose that permafrost? How many, I'm not talking about woolly mammoths springing out of the earth, but rather, what kind of viruses, what kind of bacteria, what kind of what all is in there that we don't know anything about that might actually harm us? So when we talk about the Arctic region, we are talking about basically 6 nations whose economic zone, whose exclusive economic zone gives them a right to negotiate up in that area. But there's 2 more who, without the literal access, but they're still in the Arctic region. The 6 are, of course, Russia, the United States because of Alaska, Canada, Denmark because it owns Greenland currently. Iceland is not actually physically within the realm of the Arctic Circle, but its economic zone is, and of course Norway. That leaves 2 others, Sweden and Finland, and they have no access to the Arctic Ocean, but they're in the Arctic region. These are the members of the Arctic Council. It is their responsibility to negotiate in good faith what happens in the Arctic. However, Russia is currently hastening ice-free territorial waters. Now, the distinction, of course, is territorial waters go out 12 miles. Economic zone goes out an additional 200 miles. Those 12 miles, we really can't tell the Russians what to do. But we can sure as hell, if it goes 12 miles and 1 inch, as a world, or as a nation, or as an Arctic Council, find ways to make sure that it goes no further. You will note they have the hugest land area, and a massive amount of their industry is already up here, warming up the Arctic region. It's a wonderful route economically, but what harm are we doing to the environment, and how are we changing the balance of power at the same time? As I mentioned here, the planet might be harmed, but hey, that's not Putin's problem right now. His problem is staying in power and bringing Russia back to what he believes is Russia's rightful place as the most important nation in the world. It's their business within those 12 miles until it isn't. And that's why you say all nations led by the Arctic Council have a stake in this. Russia's 9-dash line. So here's an example. If all goes smoothly for Russia, Russia sells more oil and gas and timber and diamonds and everything else to the rest of the world. Currently, 30% of their GDP already comes from the Arctic region. They'd like it to be even more. It's a nation that is a truly Arctic nation. That's where many of their resources are. One of their regulations, one of their rules already is that if you're going to go that route, you will have a Russian icebreaker taking you through there. There will be no such thing as any other nation being allowed to do that. It's always going to be Russians piloting through at some charge. Only Russian ships can carry any fuels in and out. Why? Because Russia is the world's gas station. Russia's economy depends on selling oil and gas, and they got a lot more of it up in the Arctic. So they're not dumb. Only their ships are going to be able to carry any fuels. And for now, the only ice-free route is through these Russian territorial waters, and personally, I'd like to keep it that way. Now, what are the stumbling blocks for the Russians? Well, you need all-weather infrastructure, and you need humans. You need people to live there, which means you have to create some kind of a civil society. You have to have some way of people to enjoy themselves there. This is what they're going to deal with. What could go wrong? This is a gamble that Russia is taking. This is a nation that lives by extractive industries. Get the coal out of the ground, get the gas out of the ground, get the diamonds out of the ground, get the aluminum out of the ground. They're already about nearly 100% mining and drilling. And what they're doing is putting themselves in a position where they're even more dependent upon those extractive industries. So who's most serious about controlling the Arctic? I give you one graphic. The Russians have more icebreakers than every other nation you see on that chart combined. And they're building more at a faster rate than anyone else. So who's most serious about owning it all? That might be our friends the Chinese. A country with deep pockets and big ambitions. So the Chinese came out with their own Arctic white paper in 2017 to let the world know where they stood on the issue. Well, the first thing it says in the white paper is, China is a near Arctic state. Okay, folks, you see what I've done up there. Here's the Arctic, here's the near Arctic state. Now, I'm not even talking about all the ocean they have to traverse to get to the Arctic Ocean. I mean, as the crow flies, if that is the near Arctic state, so is Ukraine. If that is the near Arctic state, so is Mexico. And they call it the Polar Silk Road. That's right. And with a straight face, they say about the Arctic, all nations should have complete access to these international waters. I say with a straight face because How come the South China Sea gets to be 100% theirs, but the Arctic has to be open to everybody? It gets a little sillier yet. The dragons are circling. Xinhua, the Chinese national paper, says the LNG project developed jointly by China and Russia. China gave them money. But I guess that's part of joint development, if you want to think of it that way. And also quoting Xinhua, this passage through the Arctic Circle is called the Silk Road on Ice. How many of you call it the Silk Road on Ice? How many of you have ever heard it called the Silk Road on Ice? Even the Russians don't call it the Silk Road on Ice. But never one to miss a PR opportunity. The Chinese are right there. And again, the hypocrisy. Admiral Zhu, who has the responsibility for that part of the world's oceans in China, the Arctic belongs to all people around the world. No nation has sovereignty over it. China must play an indispensable role because we have a fifth of the world's population. That's not exactly a reason why you should be part of controlling the Arctic, but that's what they believe. And what they're doing about it is a charm initiative, as they often have done. And that charm initiative consists of loans, joint infrastructure, investments. They now have the largest embassy in Reykjavik Island, Iceland, because they believe that that will be the new transshipment point when all this is completed. They have stirred up trouble in Greenland, saying, you know, what has Denmark done for you people? And continue to do that kind of thing. So they're players, just in a different way than we'd like to see them play. What is the United States Arctic policy? Yeah. It pains me to report this to you, but basically, what? Who cares about the Arctic? The Russian military buildup, however, is real. And I'm not saying we should react just because they have some wonderfully capable Spetsnaz folks up there and they're developing new technologies up there and so on. This quote comes from the Deputy Prime Minister of Russia. The 1867 sale of Alaska was, and I quote, a betrayal of Russian power status, and has said the Kremlin has a right to reclaim our lost colonies. Now, I know there are people who could say, hey, if you want Northern California back, you can have it. I am not suggesting that. Every other nation that has a right to participate in the Arctic, by the members of the Arctic Council, by coincidence, are all NATO members. Norway is a good example. The U.S. is behind the curve, frankly. And we've done a little more training, sent a couple more Air Force fighters up to Alaska. We've planned a U.S. Coast Guard upgrade. Again, this is deterrent, folks. It's not offensive. But for heaven's sakes, let's not just forget that the Arctic exists. Here's Norway's response. By the way, these are not Norwegians. This is our posse here. These are Special Forces folks. They're working with the Norwegians right now. They have invited more troops to the U.S. for joint field exercises. Same with air battle training. Same for adding ships to its fleet. To this, the Russian embassy said, we view it as unfriendly. Oh, darn. It will not remain without consequences. The Norwegian response was, let's get 700 more U.S. Marines there. On so many fronts, this is a Cold War, both literal and figurative. I believe we are in a new Cold War, and I'd like to keep it cold rather than hot, and the Arctic is just one part of it. When I say, will the world sell China the rope, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the saying attributed to Lenin, even though he never said it, when it comes time for us to hang them, the capitalists will line up to sell us the rope. The free world won the last Cold War, not with bullets, but with strong leadership, united resolve, steadily standing in the face of bullies, saying, that's enough, that's far enough, we have the capability to stop you. And they're not stupid. They'll understand that. This Cold War can be won the same way. I leave you with this. It isn't only about us, and by us I don't mean just the United States and its allies, the Arctic Council, all of our adversaries. I mean, it ain't just about our species. One of these days, before I die, I want to be close enough to this guy to take that picture. So with that, from me and the rest of the boys and girls, I say, thank you.